Hi, welcome back to Father-Offspring Interviews, episode 28. So, after a lovely stretch of being in person, we are sadly back to virtual interviews here, but we are excited as always to get into these topics today. So, for our first question, a viewer said, Dr. Sapolsky, what do you think are some of the likely reasons for humans being capable of cognitive bias behaviorally and evolutionarily? Or do you think that it's just an emergent property of consciousness that is especially visible in the modern age?
Well, that is a great question. I think the answer is why do we have it? Because it is very often a useful thing that we've evolved. Okay, cognitive biases, that comes with all sorts of bad press, and in a sense that that's not very useful. We can probably translate cognitive biases for our purposes into unconscious shortcuts, rules of thumb that we use for navigating the world to allow us to make quick decisions, quick assessments of things. For example, you're about to walk down one of two streets, and you were told on the street, this one, you will encounter a 20-year-old male. On that street, you will encounter an 80-year-old woman, and one of them is going to attempt to rob you and beat you senseless. Which do you think it's more likely to be? And a cognitive bias would be, well, I suspect the 20-year-old male is more likely to be dangerous than the 80-year-old female. So the cognitive bias makes you go in that direction. It's a shortcut. It's a rule of thumb that in general, 20-year-olds more dangerous than 80-year-olds, all of this. Now, this got formalized some years ago by these two psychologists, Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman, with the term heuristics. Heuristics was sort of a fancy version of cognitive biases, of them pointing out there's patterns to them. There's patterns to what would initially seem irrational behavior, irrational economic behavior, but there's patterned irrationality. Okay, so what would some of these cognitive biases, some of these heuristics look like? One really famous one is the endowment effect. Okay, here's this object, here's this giga, this tchotchke. How much would you pay for it? $10. So you pay $10 for it, and now you are endowed with it. And someone says, ooh, I want to buy it from you. How much will it cost me? And you'll say 11 bucks, 12. It is immediately, irrationally more valuable because it's something that you possess. Same way in economics, loss aversion. Two versions to doing the same thing. Here's this test. If you get the answer right, we give you a buck, versus here's a buck. If you get the answer right, you get to keep it. If you get it wrong, you've got to give it back. And people find it much more aversive, the notion of having to give it up. Logically, absolutely the same. But once we possess something, we have a cognitive bias towards exaggerating its value to us. Other cognitive biases, closure. Okay, you got a choice. You can cure all the cases of one disease, or you can cure half the cases of each of two diseases. You save the same number of lives in each case, logically exactly equivalent, but people have a strong cognitive bias for closure. Let me wipe this disease off the map there that we've gotten rid of all the cases for that. We value that more as a cognitive bias, a cognitive distortion. Here's one of the ones I love. I don't know if this is true, but apparently it has been shown that people find rhyming couplets to be more convincing than if they weren't rhymed. And any of you listening who are history buffs will recognize the phrase, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. And if not, look it up and see how the irrationality of that played out in a court of law. Which other ones? A very famous one is recency effect, which actually is a subset of another bunch of other attributes. Okay, I sit you down and I'm going to read off, I don't know, 10 names or so in fairly rapid sequence. Don't write them down. You need to listen to them. Okay, they are James, Tom, Bill, Charles, Obadiah, Edward, Joe, Dan, George, And now we come back 10 minutes from now and say, okay, can you recall any of those names? And what you see is three properties. People are more likely than average to remember the first name, James. They are more likely to remember the last name, George, as the most recent one, and they're most likely to remember the most interesting one, the most exceptional one. Joe, Billy, whatever. There's Obadiah. Obadiah is more likely to get remembered. So a subset of that specifically is the recency effect. Things that are more recent is one of the characteristics that enhances memory. Things that are more recent, we give more value to when we're making assessments about things. The first thing in a sequence has an atypically large influence on how we assess the entire sequence. The last thing in the sequence does as well. And Kahneman and Tversky, you cannot say either of their names without the other. Sadly, Tversky died quite young, about 25 years ago, and they were inseparable as a research team. Kahneman, who only died a few months ago in his 80s, eventually got the Nobel Prize, and both of them would have gotten it absolutely. But here was a study that Kahneman did after Tversky died, taking advantage of this recency effect. Here's what he discovered. Big problem in medicine. You get somebody goes in for a colonoscopy to see if there's any sort of cancerous something or other starting there. And it is not fun. It is not pleasant. And once you hit a certain age, you're supposed to get a colonoscopy every 10 years, every 5 years, or whatever. And noting a big problem is it's like unpleasant. You got this probe in there, and at the end they take it out and it hurts, and you remember that, and like you really don't want to. So there's a very low compliance rate of people coming back and doing follow-ups. Here's what Kahneman did. He had proctologists, urologists, whatever these people were, he had them do colonoscopies on people, either the usual way, you get your sample or you've looked around at things and then you pull out the probe, or you're all done with it and you wait a while. You wait a while with the probe in there, so the unpleasantness of the snipping off the tissue or whatever is long past, and then you take the probe out so that the most recent sensation you associate with this was not the pain right near the end. Ooh, clip, 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 out it comes. Clip, clip, clip. Let's wait a while. Let's go get a drink and then come back and take it. And you got much better compliance when the most recent feature of the colonoscopy experience was it just kind of sitting there and sure, not fun, but not overtly unpleasant or what. So that's showing that cognitive bias. What other ones? A really striking one that has all sorts of bad implications when we're trying to make sense of our own behaviors when they are rotten. We come up with situational attributions. I did this rotten thing just now because I'm tired, I'm stressed, I was distracted, the person was mean to me, whatever. Somebody else does something rotten. Why did they do that? We have a bias towards coming up with constitutional explanations. That's the way they are. They've always been. They always will be. That's what it's like. And this particular cognitive bias has a cognitive explanation to it, in that when you are assessing your own behavior, you have access to your internal thoughts. You have access to how irritated you were thinking about whatever it is that was stressing you. Whereas when you were observing their behavior, all you're seeing is the external manifestation. Internal, I have a bias for attributing it to something situational because I have knowledge of it. External, so that's one way in which you get there. There's an additional way that you see this cognitive bias particularly badly when when a member of our in-group does something bad, we come up with situational explanations. When it's a them, we come up with constitutional ones. Situational because it's easier for us to imagine what's going on in one of us's heads than there. But even more so when one of us does something crummy, that's just sort of a transient, like this was a special case. Them, That's what they're like. What can I tell you? That's what they're always going to be. So that being a cognitive bias. There's another one I saw. I have no idea why it's called this, but it's called the GI Joe fallacy. And I should read and find out why they call it. But the fallacy is that if you are aware of a cognitive bias, you won't fall for it. And that turns out to be very fallacious. Okay, so the question is, where do these come from? Do they just emerge? You get complicated enough of a brain, and you have certain cognitive biases. You pay more attention to first things and last things. You would rather gain something than gain it and then have to give it back, things, or never gain it at all. Do they just emerge, or do they have some sort of advantage? And they certainly do, because again, they're a shorthand. They're a time saver. They're allowing you to have a rule of thumb. On the average, I'm going to go down the street that has the old woman in it instead of the 20-year-old guy. On the average, I have opinions, guesses above the chance level as to which one of them is more likely to pull a knife on me or whatever. It's efficient. It saves you an effort of having to think through individual cases, and you can see how great that is. And if you think for 2 seconds, you can see just where that's going to get us into trouble. Is that more frequent in common life? In current contemporary life, absolutely, because we are being bombarded with novelty, novel thoughts, novel cultures, novel faces, and we get thrown into either I can sit there and try to decide, do I understand this individual, or do I just quickly do a heuristic shortcut, a cognitive bias of saying, oh, I know what those sorts of people are like. And that is leading us right to where the dangers are of cognitive biases and heuristics. The first one is obviously you can have a general stereotyped conclusion about a group, and it could be completely wrong. I can deeply believe, can have a cognitive bias that the most skillful constructors of igloos on Earth are people from Zimbabwe. That's not true, almost certainly. So your overall starting assumption may not be true, or your overall assumption could be true statistically on the average, on a populational level. That may be the case, but that doesn't mean you can prejudge that individual with the statistical conclusions you've made about a population as a whole. When you prejudge like that, that is what prejudice is. That is what projecting a stereotype onto someone. So cognitive biases, they're a good, helpful shorthand if you do them in the right circumstances. And if you don't, they are grounds for wonderful rationalization for mistreatment of people.
And of course, it's one of those situations where if you already are having an irrational reaction, such as your amygdala overreacting to something, you're going to do a worse job of filtering out whether or not this bias is applicable. And then you get a vicious cycle. So
exactly. The amygdala is home sweet home for cognitive biases, rational or otherwise. Exactly.
Okay, so next, Shabam from India asks, what are Munchausen's and Munchausen by proxy, MBP, syndromes? Is it known why mostly mothers are involved?
Oh, this is a great question. This is one of those outposts of just how fascinating is it that brains can go wrong. Fascinating unless you were personally touched by it, in which case it's a tragedy. Munchausen disease. I'm a crass American, so I say Munchausen instead of Munchausen, but Munchausen disease. This is just like meat and potatoes psychiatric problem. This is someone who confabulates symptoms in themselves of a medical problem. They go to a doctor, they say, I've got this pain, I've got that, I can't wake up, I've got the runs all the time, whatever it is, you got to figure it out. And there's nothing wrong. And this elaborate sort of thing there. It's not out of anxiety. They're not anxious that they just get a sort of comfort out of going in and saying, I feel like I have these problems. Take care of me, legitimize my concerns, envelop me in your expertise, whatever. So that's Munchausen. So I had known about that for years. And then there's Munchausen by proxy, where someone does it to their kid. They fabricate medical symptoms in their child. Okay, lots of us will know a famous case of it, a famous case of a victim of Munchausen by proxy, Gypsy Rose Blanchard. And go look her up and like horrifying, irresistible story. Her mother, Dee Dee Blanchard, is the one who would be categorized as having had Munchausen by proxy inflicted upon her daughter, Gypsy Rose. So that is sort of the People magazine version of it. What is it about? The general theme is a parent reports physical illness, physical abnormalities in their child that are not really there. Mildest version, you take your kid into the pediatrician and you say, oh my God, my child, they wake up all the time. Whenever they eat, they seem to be in horrible pain and have gas afterward. You just report a bunch of symptoms. Then it could become the next more serious step. Doctor says, okay, let's get a urine sample. You're saying your child appears to be in pain every time they're urinating. If you can collect a urine sample. And what Munchausen by proxy parents then would do, for example, is prick their finger and dribble some blood into it. Oh my God, there's blood in my child's urine. As documented in one case, a woman who put some of her menstrual blood into her baby's urine sample, which completely confused the doctors because look, we just checked the urine now, and there's all these bacteria that explain everything. Let's take another sample 3 days from now and it's completely different bacteria. We have never seen this before in science, that you have this florid bacterial infection of the urinary tract, and then you've got a completely different one a few days. Whoa, what's up with that? But then the ultimate is when it's not just fabricating reports, it's not just messing with samples, it's when generating illness in your own child. And this is where, like, you reel with how bizarre, how disturbing this is. You get Munchausen by proxy parents who will use some caustic material to generate a rash on their child. Look, my child has this rash for no. You give them Epicac, this poison you keep around. If somebody ever swallows anything toxic, you make them swallow it and they will throw everything, and you force feed your infant Epicac so that they're throwing up. And when you bring them in, they're still throwing up and their electrolytes are all screwed up from that. And whoa, this looks serious. You make them drink some bleach. I kid you not. You report that your child keeps stopping breathing during the night. Ooh, do we have sleep apnea? Let's get a sleep monitor to tell if your child really does. And it turns out smothering the child every hour and a half or so to cause them to stop breathing for a minute or so. Whoa, look, that's one of the most severe cases of apnea I've ever seen. You inject the child with insulin to cause severe hypoglycemic shock. You force feed laxatives as one of the documented cases that make you sort of blanch. In one documented case, a Munchausen by proxy parent was discovered to have been taking filtrate of dog feces and injecting it into their child's IV line. And what do you know? A massive infection in the circulatory system. And yeah, nightmare stuff. About 10% of the kids who were victims of a Munchausen by proxy parent die. It is highly, highly dangerous. So what are the characteristics? First off, typically the kid is under 5-6 years of age. The 2-year-old is not in much of a position to say, when nobody's looking, mommy spits into my feeding tube or whatever. So it's typically a very young child or infants where it starts there. But as encompassed in the question, overwhelmingly, 95% of the time, if not more, it's the mother. It's the mother who's a single mother, or in cases where there's a father around, the father is disconnected, unaware of stuff that's happening, is highly socially dominated by the mother. What it is a diagnosis that is overwhelmingly about mothers. So what's going on with it? Easy explanation. Oh, you have this tragically ill child, and you can take him to telethon fundraisers and get a wish a wish, dream a wish, whatever that, make a wish, make a wish. Gypsy Rose Blanchard was sent to Disneyland or Disney World or Disney Proxy or whatever on the money from. Yeah, there's often material gain. People give money to build a house for you because your poor mother or whatever. Yeah, there's material gain in a lot of cases. That ain't what it's about. That could come along some of the time, but that's not the primary motive. What it is instead is another version of the Munchausen. There's a psychological profile where you just want to be enveloped in the medical system, cared for, looked after, where it's this addictive process for some people, and addictive in this case for having their child in this system, because you are just welcomed into that world with sensitivity and empathy and care and concern and validation of whatever you've concocted. And it's very addictive for a subset of people. You see a particular style of these Munchausen by proxy mothers, which is they get very, very inveigled into the lives of the medical staff. They are there at the pediatric ward 24/7. They are there all the time. They are on top of every lab result, all of that. What is often noted is they don't seem especially upset when there seems to be a setback. Whoa, completely new bacteria in your child's bloodstream or whatever. They don't seem to get, but they're incredibly present and devoted. They help out with every procedure. They help the nurses with that. They're incredibly sort of aware of people. They show up with brownies for the nursing staff. They somehow learn everybody's birthday and make cards for them. They're so concerned. They're everybody's shoulder to lean on. All the nurses have been convinced they have found a new best friend because they're so understanding and so solicitous. And like they walk down the hallway and one of the healthcare people will say to the other, "Do you know who her child is? That's the kid with those crazy blood infections they can't figure out. Oh my God, she's like a saint. She's here all the time. She's like a saint. She's here all the time." They become sort of a mascot of the ward. They become sort of a notable civilian in there. They get all sorts of access to the whole process. And there comes another feature that occurs at way higher than chance level. Munchausen by proxy mothers, way more likely than chance, have a history of some sort of medical training. Medical stenography, nursing school, medical school, something. They got some sort of training in this stuff. Gypsy Rose Blanchard's mother was a nurse's aide earlier in her life. And this key thing, not only that they have some background, some training in medical stuff, but they failed at it. They failed. They were dropped out of the program. They had to drop out because of this or that. They failed at it. And there's a whole speculated psychological extra layer of psychiatrists who think about this, which is it's not only people who have some medical smarts who can get away with doing this, who know how to sneak into your child's room, undo the IV line, and inject in some dog shit and put it back there again, but that there's some weird unconscious, I'm going to show them. They booted me out of here. I've got all of them fooled. My child has gone through more different invasive exams, more different scans, more different anesthetizations and surgeries, which is absolutely often the case with that. And none of it's true. And I pulled this off on all of them. How do they often get discovered? You begin to get someone who starts being suspicious. That's interesting. The kid only spikes a fever when the mother is around because she just injected bacteria. That's interesting. You walk into the room and the mother was doing something with the kid, and the kid was sort of crying, and the mother was sort of shushing them and covering them up, and seems all. What was the mother doing? What was the mother? And eventually, there's enough suspicion that somebody puts a closed circuit TV camera in the room, and then you finally see what's happening. Who is it who typically does it in these studies? The head nurse. the head nurse who is tough, who is jaded, who is not looking for a best friend among the parents of the patients, who does not care if somebody brings him chocolate chip cookies that they baked, who has seen it all, who is cynical, who is hard to manipulate, and who's typically the first one begin to think something's not fitting together here. And what often happens is when the head nurse can now document what was going on, nobody believes the nurse. Everyone says that couldn't be, that couldn't be. Why is it? Because it's so shocking. This is the most devoted one case that was documented. This was not just a Munchausen by proxy mother bringing chocolate chip cookies, being a good Samaritan. She was the major fundraiser for the pediatric ward. That was her version of getting involved in life there. So everyone, they can't believe it. They can't believe it. They can't believe it because, in addition, there's an enormous emotional investment in not wanting to make this diagnosis because implicit in that is you just got fooled into probing and poking and injecting and forcing medicine down and anesthetizing and operating and doing all these things to a child when you never figured out there was nothing wrong. It's probably the psychiatric diagnosis that healthcare professionals are most emotionally resistant to wanting to come up with, to having to admit to. So, one additional feature of it, and when you think about it, this is not surprising, you begin to see these ego boundary problems. You very often see both Munchausen in the mother and Munchausen by proxy in the kid. The mother has a long history of Munchausen. She has a child, and suddenly hers disappears, and the child is infected with it. You see sort of this pathological coexistence there of borders just kind of disintegrated. Okay, so that's Munchausen by proxy. All of that said, it is an incredibly controversial diagnosis because if you get it wrong, if you accuse somebody of it, and that is not the case, that is a whole separate world of a horrible, nightmarish outcome. And there are by now documented cases, one family, for example, a mother who lost 5 infants in a row to seemingly sudden infant death syndrome. And before it was over with, there was suspicion she had to be smothering them, and she was eventually convicted of murder. The assumption was she had killed, smothered all 5 of her babies over the course of 10 years until somebody figured out, ooh, there was a mutation in the family in a gene expressed in the brainstem that controlled automatic breathing. It was, and she was let out of jail. It is a horrifying diagnosis to miss. It is a horrifying diagnosis to make, and it's a horrifying diagnosis to make by accident. Everything that's touched by it is terrible. So that's Munchausen by proxy.
And that is it for episode 28. Keep submitting your questions at the form found in the Instagram story highlight in bio or the YouTube video description. I'm Offspring Sapolsky, and thanks for your continued support of Science and the Beard.